Hello, guys, and welcome back to my Cold War stories. And today, in our 10th lecture, I am going to talk about the Soviets' mistake by going into Afghanistan in December of 1979. And I'm also going to be talking about the bycode of the 1980 Summer Olympics, which took place in Moscow in the summer of 1980. So first, I'm going to talk about Afghanistan, and then I'm going to talk about the bycode of the Summer Olympics of 1980. So Afghanistan is a small country located in the Middle East. It's located between Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Pakistan, and Iran. So that's where it's located. And it's also considered the graveyard of empires because there were a bunch of empires there, like the Persian Empire, the Academian Empire, the Seleucid Empire, which the Academian Empire was conquered by Alexander the Great, which was 1,000 years prior to the Soviet-Afghan invasion or the war going on there. And so Afghanistan was a communist government at the time because it was led by Ming. I forget his first name because it's hard to pronounce, but the country was being led by Amin. And so it was also in 1979, that was when Iranian Revolution happened, and so Iran became a Islamic nation. And so Soviet Union was afraid that Islam was going to spread into Afghanistan, which was a communist country, and then it would fall under Islam, and then it would spread to other Western Soviet republics like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and even spread to further republics of the U.S.S.R. or the Soviet Empire. And so Soviet Union had to make a decision to invade Afghanistan. So they had to, there were some decisions in the Politburo, or which was this top government officials of the Communist Party of the U.S.S.R. And so they met up and they made a decision about invading Afghanistan, or which at the time was the Democratic People's Republic of Afghanistan. Democratic People's Republic of Afghanistan, yeah. And so during most of 1979, there were most decisions made in the Politburo. And so there were a lot of decisions being made in the Politburo. There was a meeting between, Brezhnev and Andropov, who was chairman of the KGB at the time. He'd been chairman of the KGB from 1967 all the way until 1982. So that's how long he'd been chairman of the KGB. And so he also met up with Dmitry Ustinov, who was the Minister of Defense of the Soviet Union. And they discussed about they need to make a decision about invading Afghanistan. And so it was on December 12th of 1979, there was a meeting going on between Andropov and Ustinov. These two men made an agreement about invading the country, because they made a final decision about invading the Afghanistan. And so it was known as the Ustinov-Andropov agreement, which was to invade Afghanistan. And then Brezhnev, I think, approved of it, and so they made the choice to invade Afghanistan. And so it was on Christmas Eve of 1979, December 24th, 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and then the Soviet Fourth Army invaded Afghanistan. And so communist president of Afghanistan, Amin, was kidnapped and he was killed. And they replaced him with another communist president of Afghanistan, Babrak Karmal. He became the new president of the Democratic People's Republic of Afghanistan. And so he became general secretary of the Afghanistan. And so that was kind of like a big mistake that the Soviets went to Afghanistan, because going forward, most of their troops would die in Afghanistan because they were fighting against the Mujahideen, which was being supported by the United States, China, and other Western countries, U.S., China, and other Western countries that were against the Soviet Union. And some supporters of the Soviet-Afghan War were Vietnam, um, Angola, East Germany, and a bunch of others. They supported the Soviets in the Afghan invasion, the Soviet Afghan invasion that took place in 1979. And so that war would carry on for a long period of time. It continued for almost 10 years, for 1 decade. The war was going on in Afghanistan. And so it was disastrous because a lot of troops would be dying there. And then they would have to would take out their troops out of Afghanistan. And so in Soviet Union had nothing. They had no money. They didn't have anything. A lot of people were dying in Afghanistan. And so by 1980, it was the beginning of 1980, it was a U.S. president. He gave a speech saying that the United States will not participate in the 1980 Olympics in Moscow, the Summer Olympics in Moscow, in a response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And the United States was totally against that invasion. And so they boycotted the Summer Olympics of 1980. And so, as a response, later on in 1984, it was the Summer Olympics, which were held in Los Angeles, and so that was boycotted by the Soviet Union because of the United States boycotted the Summer Olympics of 1980s as a response. And so that was a huge, that was a big deal going on in the Soviet Union because people were not being told about what was going on in Afghanistan because they kept everything a secret about the war in Afghanistan. And then it was not until between maybe late 1980s, that was the time when some Soviet some sources of Soviet Union started to say that over 1,000 of Soviet troops were dying in Afghanistan during that period. And so, I think it was by 1985, 1986, or 1987, towards the end of the war, there were some reports saying that they gave a total of how many Soviet troops were dying in Afghanistan. That was very disastrous, what was going on in Afghanistan during that time. And so, it was until it was in 1983. That was when I think it was between 1982 and 1984. That was when Andropov became new leader of Soviet Union following the death of Comrade Brezhnev in November of 1982. And he had to make a decision about taking out troops out of Afghanistan, and he declared that the invasion of Afghanistan was a big mistake for the Soviets. And so he planned to withdraw. He planned to take troops out of Afghanistan, but it was a big It was he thought the invasion was a big mistake, and so he planned to take out troops, but it never happened because he basically told they told lies to the people, like brainwashing, basically. So that's what was going on in Soviet system, and they wanted to make people believe that that the leader of Soviet Union was gonna do it. But then in reality, it never happened during the Andropov time. And so nothing much happened in Afghanistan during the Andropov and Chernenko time. It's because like Chernenko and Andropov time were very short. Like nothing big was going on during that time. But until the Gorbachev era, until Gorbachev came power, he started to make quite a lot of changes to the USSR and Afghanistan. He started to make a huge changes by taking out some of the troops in Afghanistan, and then he just took out troops out of Afghanistan, and he declared that the invasion was a mistake as well, because a lot of troops in Afghanistan were dying from the invasion because they were fighting against the Mujahideen, which was an Islamic force that was fighting against the Soviet forces in Afghanistan. And so it was between 1980 and 1989. That was when the Soviet Union planned to take out troops out of Afghanistan because they were being killed in Afghanistan, and they thought it was terrible. And so by February 15th, 1989, that was when all the Soviet troops were taken out of Afghanistan. And then that brought an end to the Soviet-Afghan War. And so after that, that brought an end to the Soviet war in Afghanistan. And so after the war ended, the Mujahideen would become known as Al Qaeda, which would be a terrorist organization that attacked the United States on September 11, 2001, which would be organized by Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden also fought in the Mujahideen against the Soviets when he was in Afghanistan. And then he would later organize the terrorist group known as Al Qaeda, and he would plan attacks across the world and including the United States on 9/11. And so some reports are saying that the Soviet-Afghan War led to 9/11 because the formation of the Taliban, and they began to plan attack on the United States. And so those were some resources saying that the Afghan Soviet War led to 9/11, which would happen 12 years later in 2001. So 12 years after the Soviet-Afghan War ended. And so now the Summer Olympics of 1980. So the Summer Olympics of 1980 were held in Moscow. It was hosted by General Secretary of the party Leonid Brezhnev, and with other top government officials were there at the Summer Olympics. And so it was held between July 19th, 1980, and the Summer Olympics ended on August 3rd, 1980. So it was held there for some time in the city of Moscow. And so during that period, there were some jokes saying that Brezhnev went on the radio or on this to give a public announcement at the Olympics, and he gave a speech, and he saw the Summer Olympics, which said, and he read the paper and he said, "Oh, oh, oh," and then another Soviet official went behind him and he said, Comrade Brezhnev, those are not O's. Those are Olympic symbols, so you don't have to read them out loud. So those were one of the jokes that were going on that happened during the Summer Olympics. I don't know if they're actually true or maybe it's fake. I don't know. So those are some reports that happened during the Summer Olympics of 1980. And so as a response to the United States boycotting the Summer Olympics, which was made by U.S. President Jimmy Carter, the Soviet Union 4 years later boycotted the Summer Olympics of 1984 because the United States boycotted the Summer Olympics of 1980, which were held in Moscow. And as a response, the Soviet Union boycotted the Summer Olympics of 1984, which were held in Los Angeles. Because that was the same time when the war in Afghanistan was still going on between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. So I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture. So please drop a like and subscribe. In our next lecture, I'm going to talk about the worst corruption in Soviet history, and then I'm going to talk about the election of U.S. President Ronald Reagan. So I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see you guys in my next lecture.